Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. Canada has been seen as a haven for immigrants for years. But in the years since COVID-19 first struck, the country has been focused on lower-skilled labor markets. You know, the ones considered essential when everything shut down. But now that things are back up and running, in Commentary 662 titled Optimizing Immigration for Economic Growth, the CDL Institute argues that Canada's economic class immigration system needs to return to its roots by prioritizing highly skilled newcomers based on expected earnings levels. Meet Mikal Skuterud, a full professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Waterloo, an Institute Fellow in Residence, and a co-author of the report. He argues that the goal should be to maximize GDP per capita in the full population.
Canada has been the envy of the world for decades for our skilled immigration system. That's what Canada's immigration system is known for, is being able to leverage immigration to raise the average skills, or what economists call the human capital of the population. So what we're arguing for is nothing radical, and certainly not a pie in the sky kind of policy proposal. It's quite simply, let's go back to what we used to do. Let's refocus on that objective, and let's do it even better.
Also a co-author of the report, Christopher Worswick. He serves as professor and chair of the Department of Economics at Carleton University. He warns that Canada can't take advantage of immigration to raise the growth rate or per capita GDP in an environment of weak capital investment.
In the best case scenario, an economy can expand almost limitless. You could just keep having labor force growth, but you have to have capital growth in the same sort of proportion. Otherwise, you're going to see diminishing returns to labor, that you're going to have too low of a sort of machinery to worker ratio.
They join us now. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Michael.
Thanks for having us.
Mikal, let's start with you, because we've discussed in the past that Canada has three types of immigration. You're not advising Ottawa to shut the door on refugees or families of existing immigrants.
No, absolutely. So the paper is very clear from the outset that what we're concerned with is policy in economic class programs, which are the biggest part of our immigration programs. And that certainly is the focus of the paper and any policy prescriptions that we provide.
Chris, give us some insight into where we were before COVID-19 and where we are today.
Right. I think prior to the pandemic, we were on track to improve our economic immigrant selection system considerably. The federal government was moving towards better selection processes. And, I think historically there's been a focus on human capital selection. So focus on choosing people whose education and work experience means that they're likely to have high earnings, maybe not in the first year or two after arrival, but within, say, a decade in Canada, they would be highly successful. I think that changed, as you pointed out, Michael, with the COVID pandemic and the short to medium-term labor challenges that we had as people were somewhat reluctant to go back to work initially for obvious reasons. So that's been a significant change. And I think what's continued since then is this idea that immigration programs in general should be tied to filling labor shortages in less skilled jobs in the economy. And that's a major concern that we have writing this paper.
So then why are we using GDP per capita as the measure of immigration success? And where are we with regard to the rest of the G7 on that?
One of the things we want to do with this paper is tie the economics of immigration literature with the economic growth literature, which really focuses on what causes average living standards to rise in some countries versus in others. And there, it's just sort of automatic. People divide by the population, because if you don't, you could have a situation in which national income goes up, but average living standards could fall. And that is a concern with a less skilled immigration program. That what you might end up doing is bringing large numbers of new immigrants whose skills or lack of skills mean that they're really going to struggle in the new labor market, no matter how hard they work. And so focusing on GDP per capita is getting at that question of what are the average living standards. And I think economists around the world, I think, would argue that that's the better measure of the success of the program. But what we want to do is focus on what's raising average living standards, and GDP per capita is a measure of that.
We spent a long time talking about this, and I think the part that often gets missed is people hear that objective, and there certainly are criticisms of using GDP per capita as a kind of an economic objective of governments, of social policy, because it is true that it's not a good indicator of the amount of inequality in a society. I think the part of the discussion that's really important for people to recognize, though, is that immigration is ultimately one policy lever. And we have to be careful that when we are thinking about, how to develop policy strategically, that we don't take a single policy lever and then try to reach multiple objectives. I mean, we could think of many other objectives we'd like immigration to satisfy, like meeting current labor market needs and lower skill labor markets. But the problem is that there's a single policy lever, and some of these objectives may not be well aligned. So when you're trying to adjust immigration to advance one objective, let's say objective A, you may be making B worse. And so there's a real obligation for governments to really tie their hands and prioritize, say, we have an economic class immigration program. We're going to pull those policy levers to try and optimize this objective. And you really got to commit to one. And in our view, GDP per capita is the most reasonable objective for a country like Canada. And a caveat here that's really important is that when we calculate GDP per capita, it's critical in a country like Canada where immigrants are sort of de facto citizens, new permanent residents are de facto citizens, that they're included in our calculation of GDP per capita.
So then where are we now and where do we need to be?
So, GDP per capita growth has been sluggish in Canada for decades. If you plot GDP per capita growth in Canada, it has, gradually fallen off over the years, over the decades. It's a long-term trend that has received much attention. It certainly was a very important part of the Economic Advisory Council that was created by the Trudeau government in their earliest days in 2016. One of the key objectives was to try and find ways to increase economic growth rates in Canada. The reality is, though, in the post-pandemic era, what we're seeing is a very precipitous drop in GDP per capita, not just growth rates, but in the actual level of GDP per capita. GDP per capita is falling in Canada. And so I think at least part of that, there's a little doubt in my mind that part of it has to do with the surging population and the shift towards lower skilled immigration. And so I think our piece that we're speaking about today is timely, and I think we have some recommendations there on how we can get Canada back on track and how we can better leverage immigration to try and boost GDP per capita growth.
So, Mikal, what would be your number one recommendation?
Well, so getting back on track is what Chris referred to earlier. Canada has been the envy of the world for decades for our skilled immigration system. That's what Canada's immigration system is known for, is being able to leverage immigration to raise the average skills, or what economists call the human capital of the population. So what we're arguing for is nothing radical, and it's certainly not a pie in the sky kind of policy proposal. It's quite simply, let's go back to what we used to do. Let's refocus on that objective, and let's do it even better. And so what the paper has are some recommendations on how to do it better in terms of, the reality is, of course, that there are the applicant pool for permanent residency in Canada far exceeds the caps that we have, how many new permanent residents we admit every year. So what that means is, of course, you can pick and choose. And when you choose person one, it means person two is not going to get chosen. So there are trade-offs there that we have to make. They're unavoidable. And so the question is how to do that in a strategic way that optimizes this objective. And that's where we make recommendations, how to do a better job of selecting those immigrants, the applicants that are going to be the most successful in Canada in terms of their future earnings in Canada.
I think what's also new in our research is that we suggest that if you focus on what can raise GDP per capita in terms of an economic immigration system, you probably want to focus on the applicants you think who are going to have earnings that are above average in the population, say within 10 years in the new country. And that's kind of like a rule of thumb that we push, is to say that, if you're admitting immigrants, if your level of immigration is such that the marginal immigrants, the last ones you're selecting, have earnings that are lower than that, this policy is probably not consistent with maximizing GDP per capita. So I think what we're recommending is, governments get back to thinking about choosing the best candidates from their immigrant pool, the economic immigrant pool, and then setting the levels such that the economic immigrants who come in are highly successful. And I think that can be done. It does mean moving away from this notion of filling in gaps or labor shortages in the lower skill part of the distribution. And a lot of people have asked us, well, how are these labor shortages going to be filled? And our answer is the way shortages are supposed to be filled in market economies is prices go up. So in this case, wages of less skilled workers should go up. And we see that as good for income inequality. So we focus on average living standards, but we are concerned about wage inequality. I think if you bring in a lot of low-skilled immigrants to fill labor shortages, you're not going to see wage growth at the low end of the wage distribution. So we think this policy is both consistent with maximizing GDP per capita, but if anything, it's likely to reduce wage inequality.
But if we're looking for doctors over ditch diggers, many of the highly skilled newcomers can't practice their skills and end up driving taxi cabs and delivering food. How do we overcome these barriers of putting their skills to use?
Well, I'll jump in on that, I guess. I think we should always take into account, are these barriers legitimate, right? If they're legitimate barriers, if someone's done a medical program in a country that has a very different medical qualifications than Canada, then I don't think we want to just ignore that. But I think what we should be thinking about is, what's the reasonable earnings expectation for this individual in Canada in 10 years? That could be working as a doctor. It might be working as a pharmacist. They might be qualified to do that. I think we often go to these extremes where we think PhDs driving taxis. That can happen anecdotally, but so this is all part of the process of evaluating the applicants for economic immigration and having realistic, data-driven, expectations of what their earnings are likely to be and select based on that.
We have to be a little bit careful sometimes, and I think this is true especially around immigration in Canada, that sometimes the narratives get ahead of the evidence. Doctors driving taxis sells newspapers. It's a good headline. But the hard reality is it isn't actually that common. It doesn't mean there aren't anecdotally cases, but when you look at the data, not that common. Increasingly Canadian immigration is coming from former international students who've studied in Canada. I'm writing a paper right now where we look at the labor market outcomes, earnings, and employment of former international students at the University of Waterloo. What we find is that on average, those graduates are outperforming Canadian-born students at the University of Waterloo in the very short term after their graduation from Waterloo. So we have to be very careful that, the doctors driving taxis, it tends to undermine this success that we're actually having on our immigration front. And so the reality is, like Chris said, is what we want to do is we want to use hard evidence. These are what we call regression models that take immigrants' characteristics when they're applying for immigration, and we use that information to try and predict their future earnings based on the success of previous arrivals of immigrants. And if what you find in that analysis is that the ditch diggers or the construction workers are those who actually have the really high earnings, then that system will in fact prioritize those applicants. That's what we want. I mean, if that's where the earnings and high returns are, if that's where the labor markets are really experiencing genuine shortages that are leading to earnings going up, then we want the immigration system to prioritize those folks. So the way that we select and the system for prioritizing shouldn't be something static. It should be something that's constantly evolving, that we're re-estimating how are immigrants doing, conditional on these characteristics they have. And I think that's something we've never done in Canada. So this is the way in which I think what we're proposing is not something dramatically new. It's just saying, let's take the system that existed in 2019 before we kind of started dismantling it. Let's go back to that, but let's improve it. And I think there's lots of potential to improve it.
Chris, connect the dots for us on highly skilled immigrants and weak capital investments. Are you saying we're not able to take advantage of the needed skill sets because we're not investing in the country?
It's a good question. I guess what I would say is that we think the system should focus on high-skilled applicants. But if we set such a large level of admission, we can have something that's referred to as absorptive capacity problems, where in the best case scenario, an economy can expand almost limitless. You could just keep having labor force growth, but you have to have capital growth in the same sort of proportion. Otherwise, you're going to see diminishing returns to labor, that you're going to have too low of a sort of machinery to worker ratio. So I think we're all three of us are concerned that with the current very high levels of immigration and really exceptional levels of temporary migration, that investment in machinery and technology is really not going to keep up with that rate of labor force growth. And I think that's a kind of parallel problem. I think on the one hand, you want to focus on high human capital applicants, but if you end up taking so many high human capital applicants and your capital investment doesn't keep up, both the private investment by firms, but also your public capital investment like hospitals and schools and sewers, if all of that infrastructure and if your housing market doesn't keep up, that's going to create problems in your economy. And I think we're concerned that that's already happening.
Well, let's get a little bit into that, particularly because, the opposition wants to tie immigration to the housing market supply. Should we?
I think the devil's in the details on that one, but I do think that when growth economists think about economies, determinants of growth, we have in mind, or they have in mind, this idea that there's no it's a market economy and there's no barriers to expansion of supply and demand as needed. The problem is if you have regulated sectors like healthcare and housing and education, if the government's regulations are not sufficiently nimble to allow for this increase in supply, so we have increase in demand for housing with more people, whether they be immigrants, temporary migrants, international students, or citizens. As the demand goes up, we need the supply to go up, otherwise prices will go up. And I think that's the concern right now about housing, that we may just be, our population growth policy through immigration and temporary migration may just be too ambitious. And the housing market, for different reasons, I'm not an expert on housing, but I think there's reason to be concerned that the housing market's not expanding fast enough to keep up with the demand.
All right, Mikal, let me throw this hot potato at you. In your commentary's introduction, you point out that most Canadians believe that immigration has a positive impact on the economy, yet most also believe that we should limit the number of immigrants Canada accepts. How do we thread that needle in this populist political climate?
My first answer to that is I think we need to tone down a lot of the hyperbolic rhetoric around immigration. And that exists at both ends of the political spectrum. On the one side, for many years in Canada, we've been hearing all this hyperbolic rhetoric about the economic potential of immigration. We hear government ministers say things like immigration is imperative to the Canadian economy or the whole economy will fall apart, which just doesn't line up with the honest evidence. On the other hand, we hear worries about immigrants replacing jobs, taking jobs away from Canadians, again, doesn't line up with the evidence. The hard reality is that in recent years, the evidence seems to be, or not the hard reality, the reality is that in recent years, immigration seems to be doing more to increase labor demand than supply, at least at a higher level. So, I mean, I think we have to tone down a lot of the rhetoric and start being just a lot more honest and nuanced. The reality is that immigration is a really complicated policy. I liken it in some ways to trade, international trade policy. Immigration probably, the short answer, probably doesn't in general do a whole lot to move GDP per capita. Trying to leverage immigration to raise GDP per capita is really tough. But what it does do, and what we know for sure, is it has distributional effects. That means that there's sort of winners and losers in the population. Some people are going to be adversely affected and some people are going to benefit. And I think international trade is very much like that. We were told through the 1990s that we all international trade would raise all boats. We would all be better off. And that simply is, in hindsight, you look back, that the evidence is clearly that wasn't right. There were people who suffered. And I think immigration is like that too. There are growing pains. There's segments of the population who struggle. And I think to be able to maintain public support in order to have an immigration system that works and that people are supportive of, I think we have to be a lot more honest about what those effects are.
I think our framework can shed light on that question as well, right? Like, I think if you think of immigrants as being kind of equal skill level to the population, then Mikal's exactly right what he's saying. But I think if we can select immigrants based on their human capital, which we've done through the comprehensive ranking system and the point system since the 1960s, we can choose, these exceptionally talented people, and they're clearly going to be beneficial, right? So if you bring in a brain surgeon who studied at Harvard and speaks English fluently, that person is going to be, in some small way, going to be raising average earnings. So there's some easy decisions of people to admit. And then the question is, if you go down the skill distribution from there, the benefits are not going to be as large. So they're not going to be paying as much taxes. They might be using more benefits. At what point do you stop, choosing that? And that's why our kind of rule of thumb about saying, well, think about selecting economic immigrants who are going to raise average human capital or average skill level. And that gives you an objective way to think about this, so that you're not saying that we should have zero economic immigration, but we're also not saying you should have infinite or arbitrarily large numbers of immigrants. And I think that's the way that economists naturally are inclined to think about that. That's what we're trying to argue in this paper.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and your insight today.
Thanks, Michael.
Mikal Skuterud is a full professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Waterloo, an Institute Fellow in Residence, and a co-author alongside Christopher Worswick, a professor and chair at the Department of Economics at Carleton University. The report was also co-authored by Matthew Doyle, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Waterloo. Read the commentary titled Optimizing Immigration for Economic Growth at cdhow.org. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thank you for joining us.
You've been listening to the C.D. Howe Institute podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. The C.D. Howe Institute is an independent, not-for-profit research institute whose mission is to raise living standards by fostering economically sound public policies. The Institute is widely considered to be Canada's most influential think tank and a trusted source of essential policy intelligence, distinguished by nonpartisan, evidence-based research and subject to definitive expert review. Visit cdhow.org and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you.